sounds.
Good. That's good. That should work. I have a microphone. The video is on. Uh, Hello, I'm Joel. I'm Joel Gurin. And I'm really pleased to be here tonight. I'm going to cover a lot of ground. I can tell already from the kinds of workshops that you've been holding with this remarkable meetup that I am by far the least technical person in this room. But I'm hoping. So this is not a technical. This will not tax the technical part of your brain. But what I'm hoping to do is to give you kind of an overview of how I'm seeing the open data landscape. You all are certainly very familiar with the concepts, you're familiar with the technology. What's very exciting right now is that I think in the space of, I would say probably the last 6 months or so, about as long as you guys have been meeting, there's been a growing interest in open data in just about every sphere of society: the nonprofit sector, advocacy, consumer groups, business, government, federal government, state and local government, and a real appreciation that we're talking about something here that is really new and different. When I first started talking to publishers about this book about a year ago, the response I got from many publishers was, "Wasn't that just like big data?" No. Well, but it's data, and there's been a lot of books about data, and we're kind of tired of data. I'm not hearing that now. What I'm hearing now is a lot of excitement about what is ultimately a real kind of democratizing impulse for data, and a way of thinking about data that is different and that I think is kind of has the potential for profound change in a number of different ways. The book that I set out to write, I mean, I'll tell you a little bit about how I got here and what I'm doing now and all that. Um, we'll see if this works. There we are. So my journey is kind of an unusual combination of nonprofit advocacy, consumer advocacy, journalism, government, and a couple of different things. I was at Consumer Reports for many years as the editorial director and then as executive VP. Among other things, launched the website consumerreports.org, which now has 3 million or so active paid subscribers and is, I think, the largest paid subscription information-based website in the world. A couple of years ago, I went to the FCC, initially as head of the Consumer Bureau, and that's how I really began getting interested in the kinds of questions that we face with open data. The chairman, Julius Janikowski, brought me on because he wanted somebody with a consumer background, and he really wanted to solve this, what seems like a simple problem, which is just figure out, how do we tell consumers, how do we help them figure out what cell phone plan to buy? All right. Well, that's interesting. You start looking at that, and the first thing you learn is that a typical wireless company might have actually more than 1,000 different plans when you look at all the permutations and combinations of handsets, data limits, fees, et cetera, et cetera. They're not comparable, et cetera. Nobody can quite figure it out. But this problem of how do you help consumers with complex multifactorial decisions shows up not only in the wireless industry, it shows up when you're talking about financial products, when you're talking about healthcare, when you're talking about any number of consumer services. So essentially, I started talking to people in other agencies, and I bothered enough people with these questions enough times that somebody finally said, "Why don't you just start a task force and figure it out?" And I ended up being invited to chair the White House task force on what we ended up calling smart disclosure, which is the release of data in ways that consumers can use. Through that, I began to meet people in the open data community. I met Beth Novak, who many of you I'm sure know, who was the head of the president's Open Government Initiative during his first term. She has just started a group called the GovLab, where I'm now senior advisor, and I'll tell you about their work just in a minute. And at the same time, I began kind of returning to my journalistic roots and deciding that I really wanted to write a book and start a website on open data, which now exists. It's called Open Data Now, hashtag Open Data Now. And I do hope, whether you choose to purchase the book or not, we'll still be friends, but I do hope that you'll take a minute and sign up. There's a little sheet there, or you can leave a card for us to send you alerts from Open Data Now, from my website, or the GovLab, or a project called the Open Data 500, which I'll tell you about later, or all three, because we really do want to build this kind of network with folks like you. So I'll tell you just the GovLab, and I'll tell you where open data fits into our larger kind of vision of really of a better society. The GovLab is based on this central idea that when governments and institutions open themselves to different kinds of participation and collaborative problem solving, things get better. That if you actually partner with citizens to make decisions, which is not the way government works most of the time, you end up with better decisions, government's more effective, and it's more legitimate. And when we've thought about what are the different kind of modalities of developing that kind of connection with people, there's really three. One is sharing responsibility. So if you all are familiar with the participatory budgeting movement, where a city will say, okay, we're going to take a piece of our budget, we're going to delegate it to the community to decide, and it's not like the community advising government, it's like truly people decide what to do with that money. That's what we would see as sharing responsibility. That's an experiment that's now happening in about 1,500 cities around the world. And I think with some good success, the main constraint is that right now most cities are only willing to let go of a little piece of their budget, but over time that could be very effective. The second modality is getting knowledge and expertise in. We're looking at a lot of kind of expert networks and platforms that we think state, local, and the federal government can use to really bring in more expertise than they have and make better decisions. But then the third is getting open data out, that we're seeing open data as a major piece of improved governance. Other people are looking at it from the perspective of a business resource, a source of material for advocacy, and so on. And often these are the same people. So, in other words, I was just on a panel this morning in Washington for Data Innovation Day, which was kicked off by Nick Sinai, who's now Deputy Chief Technology Officer of the US, who is talking both about open data as part of good government and open data as a way that government can help develop new businesses and new business potential. So all of these different pieces, I think, are coming together, and I'm going to try to give you an overview, at least of how I see it. So there are, of course, many good definitions of open data out there from the Open Knowledge Foundation and Sunlight and others. For this book, I've taken a fairly broad view because I think some of the definitions have really focused specifically on government data. So I'm seeing open data as accessible public data that anybody can use to launch new ventures, analyze patterns, make decisions, solve complex problems. So this includes not only government open data, but open data that's garnered from social media, or open data that comes from the scientific research community, or other sources, or data that companies release about themselves. So what we're seeing, I think, is a real kind of ecosystem here of many different kinds of data that all, in one way or another, are probably amenable to some of the same kinds of analysis, and also to different kinds of mashups that can be productive. I think when you look at it that broadly, you see a real broad range of impact. I mean, you can see impact in everything from business and entrepreneurship to the investment community, scientists, journalists, consumers, and so on. And it's interesting. I mean, I've talked to some friends of mine from the consumer world, and we've had this kind of discussion of, well, if you're just sort of talking about open data for business, is this really, in some ways, selling out, I think was the term that my friend used. Is this actually adhering to the kinds of principles of the open data movement? I think it's a good question. I think there are some applications of open data that actually can be anti-consumer, and I can talk about those a bit. But by and large, I think one of the interesting phenomena is that by the very nature of the data and by the very nature of the information that's fueling these new businesses, they tend to be businesses that are at least trying to do well by doing good. So they may be giving consumers helpful information. They may be developing ways of analyzing other companies for their environmental records, things like that that actually contribute to society as well. So what is open data and what isn't open data? All right, it's not, one of the things I've tried to do is really differentiate. Big data is not the same as open data is not the same as open government, but they're all clearly related. I have trouble getting to a really good definition of big data, and the definition I keep coming across is like something like, well, it's like really, really big data, and it's about that precise. And I think of it as big data being kind of at the limits of our ability to work with and analyze. But of course, that's going to change every year as our technology gets better, our analytic methods get better, and so on. So big data is kind of a sliding scale, almost, at least in my view. On the other hand, and open government is also sometimes means open data, sometimes it just means citizen participation. So, for example, the Obama administration has set up a website where people can sign petitions very easily. That's open government, but it's not really open data in the way we think about it. So as a result of this, I put together this Venn diagram, which I sort of think of as the grand unified theory or the not so grand unified theory of open data. And I've actually gotten pretty good response to this because I think it does sort of start to sort it out. So what you see here is the way in which open data intersects with both big data and open government. So what are the things that are not open data? All right, well, in open government, the stuff that's not open data would be some of the citizen engagement, programs like I just talked about that try to connect with citizens, but where data of any sort is not really central to it. Big data that's not open. I mean, this is actually a lot of the big data that people have focused on, which I think often is kind of problematic. It's data that's held by major retailers. It's data that, I mean, we shouldn't even get started on national security or we'll be here all night. But I mean, definitely the idea of national security data is almost antithetical to the idea of open data. So a lot of these big data sets that people are looking at, when you think about it, they're really data sets that are very closed, and they're very closed by intention. And in fact, the people who own them see the value in them as being the fact that they're closed, and that if you own the data, you control the data, and you kind of rule by doing that. All the open data stuff is just philosophically different from that, because by definition, it's data that somebody has made open on purpose, as you all know. So I've tried to map out how it intersects with both big data and open government. You get some open government, open data sets that are not so big, like budgets from state and local, cities and states, and smaller data sets, but they're open, and their openness is very important. You get large data sets that are not governmental, like data sets from scientific research. You get open data that's neither big nor governmental. And here I think, for example, about business reporting, some of the data that companies release about themselves, for example, environmental, social, and governance data, which I'll talk about more. And then you get this kind of area where it all comes together, where you have large public government data sets like the weather data, GPS data, census, Securities and Exchange Commission, healthcare, et cetera. And that does seem to be where a lot of the action is. But I think what's interesting when you start mapping this out is that there is really a large kind of sphere of open data that includes the stuff that at least the federal government thinks about all the time, weather data and so on, but really also goes well beyond that. So hopefully this is helpful, or at least doesn't confuse things even more. And you all are, certainly experts in the circle in the middle. If we have time for Q&A, I would love your thoughts on this and whether it's a useful way to think about it. Anyway, so having said all of that, whoops, I'm going to try to stay on track here. Having said all of that, I've identified about 9 open data trends that I want to walk you through very quickly, and really do hope we have some time for discussion. So these trends are liberating government data, which is kind of the initial driver from a policy perspective to get stuff out there, figuring out how to use open data to drive business growth, smart disclosure, which I talked about a minute ago, I'm going to come back to, smarter investors, and I think the whole phenomenon where more investment intelligence is actually making companies themselves better and more socially responsible, which I find a hopeful trend anyway. The whole way in which open data is shaping reputation and brands, and also I think comes into corporate responsibility. The role of personal data, which is a sort of special form of open data. The open research lab, open innovation, scientific research with open data. Data-driven cities, and then what I have called learning to live in a see-through world. What happens when open data becomes so pervasive and so important that all of us and all of our major institutions really are in some ways more transparent to each other than we might have expected. So let's take these one at a time and see where they take us. So let's start with liberating government data. So I don't know, some of you I'm sure know Todd Park, or know of, is now the Chief Technology Officer of the U.S., and who is constantly talking about Data liberation. He is all about data liberation, and President Obama has been as well. What's interesting here is that the federal government last May, in addition to just simply talking about how great open data is, established an official open data policy that says that going forward, all government data, all federal data should be open by default. In other words, unless there is some security or privacy or confidentiality reason not to make it open, then it has to be open. Now, it's one thing to say that. It's another thing to look at the fact that there's roughly 10,000 federal data sets that, 10,000 federal information systems that you have to convert to open. So when the president announced this in May, he actually chose a venue in Austin, Texas, which was a tech center, and he positioned the open data policy in a business perspective. He said it's really going to help us launch more businesses, more entrepreneurs come up with products and services we haven't even imagined yet. My take on this, as somebody who has not really been part of the business community, is that this is going to remain the compelling argument, at least for a long time, that wherever you stand in terms of your own work, the need to show business value for open data, not just in the US but in other countries, is actually kind of a prerequisite for doing the work that's going to be required to actually make this stuff open and usable. Why is that difficult? Because right now the federal data system looks kind of like this. For those of you who've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, people in government actually use this as their analogy. They actually say, yeah, what's it like dealing with federal data? Well, that last scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark? It's kind of like that, except it's actually even worse, because it's not just finding stuff that's hidden somewhere. It's not only obscure data, it's obscure and archaic data in management systems. So it's kind of like if you had all those crates and they're all labeled in different languages, right? So one is labeled in Old English and one has Egyptian hieroglyphics. I mean, you don't even have systems in some ways for getting at this stuff, and of course it's not interoperable. So this is actually a huge challenge. And what I think is great about the open data policy is that it sets out the challenge, but it is going to take a lot of work to get to that point. What does the open data policy say? It says the presumption of openness, or open by default. It says that data has to be machine readable, reusable, timely, and developed in consultation with the people who are using it. If you're familiar with the definitions of open data that the Open Knowledge Foundation and the Sunlight Foundation came up with a couple of years ago, and if you look at it on the Sunlight Foundation's website, it actually tracks this government policy tracks that very, very closely. The one interesting thing that's different is that the Sunlight Foundation definition says, and the data ought to be free, and the government stopped short of saying that. So they have an intent, I think, to make it all freely available, but that's not necessarily 100%. Nevertheless, if we can achieve this, it's going to be great. I think, though, that the only reasonable or rational way to even think about doing this is to prioritize. You can't go after everything in that virtual warehouse, on the last slide all at once and hope that you're going to transform it overnight. And I have some thoughts that I'm going to talk about towards the end of this talk about how we begin to prioritize and how we begin to find the data that really matters and focus on getting that out there in usable forms, rather than having this all or nothing kind of concept where either everything's out there, machine readable, interoperable, and wonderful, or it's all an unholy mess. I think there are ways that we can begin chipping away at it and get the most value in the most efficient way. The other piece that's happening in Washington now is the Data Act. And you can actually find one thing in this world that Ralph Nader and Grover Norquist agree on, and this is it. This is probably the only thing. But they actually have both come out in support of the Data Act. For those of you who may not have followed this, it was passed by the House of Representatives with only one dissenting vote. I always forget who that guy was. But it's passed virtually unanimously. It has strong bipartisan leadership. I was actually at a book launch for the book last night in Washington that the Data Transparency Coalition and FedScoop very generously put on. Data Transparency Coalition is a group that has organized to lobby for passage of the Data Act. What is the Data Act? It stands for Digital Accountability and Transparency Act. So literally, it's the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, which somebody could have done a better acronyming job. But what it essentially says, it's very focused on federal spending. and it's focused on developing a really machine-readable, very detailed approach to federal spending disclosure that would be much, much better than what we have now through usaspending.gov. usaspending.gov, if you go to that site, is a great idea, but it doesn't get down to the level of subcontractors and subcontractors, so it's very easy to hide payments. And also, according to a Sunlight Foundation analysis, it has the slight problem that when you really look at the numbers, it's off by about $1.55 trillion, at least the last time they looked. So this would be a system that would automate disclosure and in ways that really improve the accuracy as well as the usability of the data. Now, what's interesting here, if you contrast this with President Obama's statement about building new businesses and giving fuel to entrepreneurs, they're really two sides of the same coin. Part of open government data is about real meaningful government transparency, about how the government does its work. Another part of government data is saying, the government in its work becomes a huge data resource by all the data they collect. Taxpayers paid for it, taxpayers should get it back for free, and that's the stuff that the president was talking about in the open data policy. So these two things together and other stuff that's going on really have the potential to make a tremendous difference, and I think if we can figure out how to implement them right, and if we can get this thing passed, which I think it will, we're going to see, at least on the federal level, some real changes, and I think they'll probably be mirrored or already are being mirrored at the city and state level. So that does take us into the second theme, which is driving business growth. Well, what are some of the examples? I'm actually going to be talking about these throughout the talk, but just to give you kind of a taste of it, the interesting thing here is that we are beginning to see open data fueling businesses all over the place: health, education, energy, finance, transportation, on and on. It's not like there's one particular kind of open data that by some fluke happened to be useful to one particular kind of business. At the GovLab, we're now doing this project called the Open Data 500. As I'll talk about shortly, this is a project to identify 500 companies that are using open government data as a key business resource. We've actually found them. We think there are more. And they're all over the place. They're all over the country. They're large. They're small. And they each have some really interesting things to tell us. Now, we do know from a number of studies, all of which involve a certain amount of hand waving, but nevertheless, the speculations, I would say, converge pretty well. We know from a number of studies that open data, I would say, has a high economic value. The number that's being talked about the most now is McKinsey, which put a $3 trillion annual value on open data around the world. Not just government open data, but they really counted all kinds of open data in the way that I defined earlier as well. That's the highest estimate by quite a bit that anybody's come up with. But we've seen estimates in the tens of billions of dollars or euros for what they call public sector data in Europe, or even for sectors like weather data or GPS or healthcare data in the US. So we know that we're dealing, whatever the actual numbers are, and it may almost be impossible to calculate, we know we're dealing with a pretty major economic driver. Now, the best current example is the Climate Corporation, and I think this one, this is a great company, and it tells us a couple of different things. One is, well, just the story, and they've recently gotten a lot of attention. There was a very good piece in the New Yorker about them. They've also just been sold to Monsanto for about $1 billion, which what that means in terms of their mission, I don't really know, but I think in terms of what it means as an entrepreneurial success story is pretty obvious. It's like a 7-year-old company. And I had the chance to interview their CEO. I knew them when, right? So I had connected with their CEO last spring before all this happened. And if you go in the book or if you go on my free website, either way, you'll see a pretty lengthy interview. And actually I have a half-an-hour podcast with the guy on my website, which you might find interesting. But his name is David Friedberg. He's the CEO of the Climate Corporation. Who are these guys? What do they do? Well, they started out, this is a company, so David Friedberg came out of Google. He was, like a brilliant analytic mind. I think he had majored originally in astrophysics. I think he went to Stanford as well. And he, just a brilliant guy who knew a lot of brilliant people and began to think that he could figure out, and they could figure out how to provide a form of weather insurance that was calculated so that the risk assessment was such that they could provide better weather insurance than anybody else. So to understand this, and I'll try to summarize this because it can get to be a fairly long story. But the problem with weather insurance is that traditionally you have to show the loss, right? So if you own a ski resort and it didn't snow, you have to somehow try to demonstrate how many people didn't show up and how much money they would have spent. His idea was, let's just make it simpler. Let's say that if the temperature goes above X degrees, we're going to pay you because we can do all these calculations based on weather, based on how often that's going to happen, what it's likely to cost, et cetera, et cetera. So they started out basically as high-tech insurance salespeople. What they did, though, is that they found that to really predict this accurately, a couple things happened. First is that they began focusing on farming rather than ski resorts and other kinds of things, because they realized, like, while weather is important to everybody, it's like critically important to farmers. And as they got into that, they realized that they really needed to work with data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and NASA and the EPA and the U.S. Geological Service, et cetera, that they had to work with this data really, really deeply. So they began doing things like getting data sets that could show the amount of rainfall to 100th of an inch on a piece of ground roughly the size of this room. Okay? And at the same time, look at a soil analysis for that piece of ground so that they could figure out what impact the rain would have on that kind of soil. And they kept going down this path to a point where, putting aside this whole insurance thing, they probably understand the dynamics of weather, climate, soil, and everything else, and how it affects farming better than anybody else on the planet. So now they're not just talking about we can sell you better insurance. Now they're talking about we can increase the productivity of farmers around the world by 20 to 30% and help them adapt to climate change. So this became a company with a mission, and I think there's two really interesting lessons from this. One is that as you dive deeper and deeper and deeper into open data, with a business perspective or with any kind of social entrepreneurial perspective, you don't really know where it's going to take you. And these guys certainly found that it took them into some very interesting and some very great territory. And the other thing is that they built $1 billion company out of completely free data. So I often find, when I talk to people who are used to kind of the data business, the traditional view is so much that the value of data comes from owning the data, right? You have to own the data, and you have to make sure nobody else gets the data, and as long as you own the data, you have a business. These guys were working with data they didn't own. Nobody owns it. Government has it. Anybody in this room could have accessed the same data theoretically. I mean, it's not, some of it takes FOIA requests, it's not that easy to get, but you can get it for free, if you ask for it and you know where to look. What they did was they brought a level of analysis and vision to it that was absolutely unique and that enabled them to do stuff with data that had been there all the time that nobody had come close to doing. So that, I think, is why we're going to see open data as a significant business driver, and we're going to see, I think, a real inversion kind of the business proposition of what makes data valuable. It's not like owning the data, it's coming up with ways to use it. This is Todd Park at the Health Data Palooza. Somebody has pointed out that the word Data Palooza can sort of translate as literally an all-out crazy party of data. So that sounds like fun. But Todd has been really promoting the use of health data, which I think may be the next big area, at least on the federal level, where we see open data applications. This Data Palooza started a couple of years ago with about 45 people meeting at Health and Human Services. Last year was about 2,000 people. And it was a sold-out crowd at one of the major, convention hotels in D.C. So they're bringing together a lot of different kinds of companies that are using health data, and we're seeing more and more of these. One of the classic ones here is a company called iTriage that was recently bought by Aetna. What these guys do is they access both, I think, open data and libraries about symptoms, plus a provider registry, so that if you are, traveling around the country or in some strange place, you have some unusual chest pain, you can immediately find out, is this something you need to go to the hospital for? And if so, it'll tell you the nearest emergency room and probably some ratings of care as well. So that's a very kind of simple, straightforward application. But we're certainly also seeing people using health data for predictive analytics, for all kinds of evaluations of health care and health cost, and potentially, I think, great opportunity there. Energy savings or energy in general is another one. This company, O-Power, which is based near Washington, has done this very creative work, pulling together both information about your own energy use, information about what energy plan you could be on with your utility that would help you save energy, And the killer here is that they also tell you how much energy your neighbors are using. So the basic idea here is you don't want your neighbors to show you up, and that turns out to be a great motivator of human behavior. Amazingly enough, who would have guessed? When I talk to them, and they're also interviewed for the book as well. They talk about the model being, if you're out in a suburban community and they have all these blue recycling bins, and every Thursday morning you're supposed to put out all your stuff in your blue recycling bin. They actually found that people got very embarrassed if they didn't have stuff to recycle. I mean, I don't know if people were actually buying things if people were actually buying plastic containers just so they'd have something to put out on the curb or not. But you don't want to be the only person who's not putting out your blue bin, and that kind of social pressure is showing up in a lot of places as a positive force. And they figured out how to harness it using open data on energy efficiency and so on. And then finally, one of the things that we're seeing to a great degree is new businesses that are all around about managing data. So think of that kind of awful warehouse of federal data, and you have equivalents in many cities and states as well. Enigma is a company that's actually right near here, right near our office at NYU, that has basically attacked the corpus of federal data, and data set by data set, they're kind of wrestling them to the ground. They're just sort of by brute force figuring out how to put these data sets into some kind of usable format in interoperable ways. They are holding this $50,000 check because they were the winner of TechCrunch Disrupt New York last May, I think, out of about 30 different contestants, which is, I think, just kind of a symbol of how this kind of figuring out how to use this kind of data is a hot area right now, and certainly a hot area for entrepreneurs. Third trend is smart disclosure, and this is the one that I spent about a year working on with the White House Task Force, more than a year, and that really came right out of my experience with Consumer Reports. So this is, how do you help consumers figure out what to buy and what kind of, and not just to save money, not just to get like a slightly better toaster. This is stuff like, what college should your kid go to? This is stuff like, what doctor should you go to who's going to provide affordable care and good care? These are major life decisions where people really have not been able to navigate the space well. So this work was inspired in many ways by Cass Sunstein. He was the co-author with Richard Thaler at the University of Chicago of the book Nudge, which was read by a lot of people in the Obama administration. I actually got my job at the FCC because somebody who I knew, who knew the people who were recruiting there, knew that everybody in the administration was reading Nudge. So I read it on the train down. The chairman interviewed me. I quoted something from Nudge. He said, "Oh, you've read Nudge?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Did somebody tell you to read that?" I said, "No, I just picked it up." So anyway, this was a very, very influential book. And the idea of Nudge was that if you give people behavioral choices and cues, they will respond in ways that are both in their own interest and ultimately good for society. Cass has recently come out with a book called Simpler, where he also talks about how you can apply this in a regulatory framework. Now, what this essentially comes down to, I mean, think about the wireless industry, for example, where I worked for a bit. Agencies like the FCC, no regulatory agency, particularly in this climate, is going to want to tell an industry what to do, right? So we had a whole debate at the FCC about what do we do about this problem called bill shock. Bill shock is where you open your cell phone bill and you go, "Oh my God, I'm shocked." And you're shocked because it's like a couple of $100s or a couple of $1,000, or in one case that we actually handled at the FCC, it's something on the order of $289,000. I kid you not, catch me afterwards, I'll tell you how that happened. But people get these insane cell phone bills. So one approach from a regulatory perspective would be to say, wireless companies, you can't do that, stop overcharging people. That would raise howls from the industry. The other approach is to say, okay, you can do whatever you want, but you have to tell people before you overcharge them. And we ultimately ended up getting a voluntary agreement from the wireless industry where they said, okay, that's what we're going to do. We're going to send you an alert. So all those alerts that you get that say, you're about to use up all your data, you're about to go over, that's the work that we did. And that's a very, very simple example of smart disclosure, but that basic idea that government can tell industries to be transparent about what they're doing is one that's very popular now as a regulatory tactic because it can be effective and it doesn't get you hammered with this idea that you're a big government and the nanny state and you're,
taking a heavy-handed approach. In fact, people call this light touch regulation. Okay, so that's something that Cass Sunstein, who was, in addition to the co-author of Nudge, he was the head of the Office of Information, I'm going to get it wrong, OIRA, which is basically the office in the federal government that oversees all regulations and sort of looks at whether they're cost effective, etc. He ran that for several years, and he was a great backer of the task force that I was privileged to chair. So, what are the different varieties of open data that help consumers make decisions? Well, the traditional ones have been pretty simple. Energy Star is a great example. You go to buy a washing machine, it has it, it doesn't have it. There also are gradations that show you how much energy they use, but I've talked to people who run the Energy Star program. They firmly believe that just that simple kind of binary thing, it's either got a star or it doesn't have a star, is really an important starting place for people. And there's a lot of debate now about how much information people really can absorb. So the nutrition facts label, for example, was debated a lot. That looks like a lot of stuff to put on something that in actuality is a fraction of that size. But in fact, there are now studies that show that something like 70% of people use this when they're buying food. So I think the number of people who read everything on there is probably very small, but a lot of people are looking just at calories or just at fat or sodium if they're sodium sensitive, etc. So this is showing us that consumers do respond to information in various ways. And there have also been some efforts, and Cass Sunstein was part of this, to figure out how to take things like the fuel economy labels and make them even more effective for consumers. So there's a whole sort of science about it. And of course, the main thing you can see here is that the old label says estimated annual fuel cost $2,039, and the new label says in big letters, you saved $1,850 over 5 years. So there's a lot of thinking going in to how to present this kind of information. Well, the big leap that needs to happen is to go from these traditional kind of print disclosures which are a form of open data, to presenting open data like the way we're used to looking at data, online in some kind of searchable, sortable way. And the model here, I think, in many ways is Kayak. Kayak, by the way, is a very interesting story because they launched at a time when they were already competing at launch with Travelocity, Orbitz, Expedia, and then Google got into the game. So it's not like they didn't have, this whole thing of it's not just owning the data. They didn't own any kind of data, and they were competing with all these other people who were already using it. What they did is they developed just a really compelling user interface, with their filters and their methodology of sorting that people just became kind of addicted to. And if you read some of the stuff that the CEO of Kayak has talked about, for him it was all about consumer experience. And these guys also were just bought for $1.8 billion, I think, by Priceline. But the metaphor that we started to use on the Task Force for Smart Disclosure was like, what if there was a Kayak for everything? What if you could do this same kind of thing for, for mortgages, for college, and so on? And I think a lot of where we're seeing the application of open data going is in exactly that direction. It's to websites and apps that enable you to sort by what is important to you. I mean, if I asked any of you, what's the best flight tomorrow from New York to LA, there's however many people in this room that we'd have like 50 different answers. Because when do you want to fly? Do you have a favorite airline? Do you hate commuter jets? Well, you're not going to get one of those to LA, but you get the point. There's very, very many variables, and they're all individual variables. When you get into some of these other consumer decisions, they're highly, highly individualized, and the ability to take kind of individual data, put it together with data about the products and services, and as open data, and make it usable for people is really where I think we're going to see a lot of activity, and I think it'll be very good for consumers when it happens. I just want to show you two examples. One that I like a lot. This is actually a nonprofit called Great Schools that sort of started quietly about 15 years ago. And they're doing two different things. They're evaluating public schools based on state records, and they're also evaluating them based on feedback from parents and former students and so on. And you can see those don't always match up. I mean, just at the very bottom of the screen, this is a school that got a 2 out of 10 based on the state ratings, but got 4 stars based on the community ratings. So sometimes there's some interesting kind of stuff going on there that I think they're still trying to figure out. But the main point here is that this is a site that's now used by something like 40 to 50% of every American household with kids in K through 12, which is phenomenal. And what it shows is that on important decisions like this, open data presented in a way that people can use is incredibly compelling. In the UK, there's also been some very interesting experiments with this. This is sort of my favorite. This is a site called Compare the Market, and at some point, probably after a couple of beers, somebody at Compare the Market was saying, "Ah, compare the meerkat," and said it with a Russian accent. This then became their thing. They developed a spokesmeerkat named Alexander Orlov. They developed a series of stuffed toys. They developed a series of books. They developed like this unbelievable marketing campaign. Apparently, a year or two ago, they were going to sell these in Harrods for Christmas, and the owner of Harrods was so concerned that the store was going to be flooded by people wanting these stuffed meerkats that he basically gave them all to charity. So this became a kind of cultural phenomenon in the UK. Don't ask me why. But what's interesting about this is that these guys are doing something that has not really been done in the US yet, which is if you look at this, you can evaluate, car insurance or energy or credit cards or travel insurance. So what they're trying to do is do smart disclosure on all these consumer services in one place. This is the kind of thing that should work, but it's been difficult to make it work in a consumer-friendly way. One of the problems here is that the common business model for these kinds of sites, and I'm not sure if it's true for this one, but for others at least, is that they get money every time you get a referral, right? So, and that's true. That's been true of the airline sites. Kayak is actually an exception because they have a different business model. But like, if you ever go on, one of these sites and wonder why you can't see Southwest Airlines, it's because they don't play that particular game. So the risk is that you're going to have companies not showing up. There's an even more worse risk that companies may steer you more towards, vendors that give them more money back. So the whole smart disclosure area is a little fraught right now. But what I think this is showing is that there is the potential, and if we do this in a consumer-friendly way, that would be much better. There's the potential for developing these kinds of what are called choice engines in a way that can be really compelling and can even get a whole nation of children to want to go buy stuffed meerkats for what that's worth. Because I don't know if that's the ultimate goal of open data, but it's interesting that it can catch on to that extent. Okay. Next trend, smarter investors and better companies. One of the areas where there's a lot of activity now is in investment advice, and what I find hopeful here is that this is not just about helping investors get rich, but that open data is beginning to take on more and more of a flavor of corporate social responsibility in a way that I think may be very helpful. So just some of the things that are happening now. This is a company also New York based called Analytics Insight that has a product called Capital Cube. Now this is based on traditional, if you can call it traditional, Securities and Exchange Commission data that's released under a system called EDGAR that's been public for quite some time. But what these guys are doing is they're applying more high level and more sophisticated analytics than have been available before. And they spent a lot of time developing this. They can now evaluate 40,000. They give you information on 40,000 public companies, which is basically all the globally traded public companies or publicly traded companies around the world for which there is decent data, and they update it every day, and they can present this to you in a way that gives you comparisons with similar companies, that shows you the risk-reward calculation, etc. That's something that would not have been possible 5 years ago. So it's a more sophisticated use of open data than we've seen before. We're also seeing the SEC is now requiring more and more reporting in XBRL, and we're beginning to see companies, CalcBench is the best example also here in New York, that are starting to figure out how to use XBRL to get at an even deeper level of analysis where it's not just better analytics but deeper data at the same time. So that's giving more and more of a view into these public companies. There's also some very interesting work going on with private companies. This is a company called DueDil for due diligence, based in the UK, although the founders are from New York and Boston. And they actually said they went to the UK to start their company because there was better public data, open data about corporations there, which is a little scary in terms of what it says about us here. But their estimate is that a lot of these small to medium-sized companies suffer because investors don't want to put in the time and effort to analyze them and see whether or not they're a safe investment. And their estimate is that there's about $250 billion worth of investment dollars that could be liberated if they could give investors an easier way to assess these companies. So that's what they do. So they're pulling together a lot of different kinds of open data, as well as some data they get from the companies themselves, and presenting snapshots of companies that make it easier to invest in them. Well, what if you're interested not only in, is a company solvent, but you're also interested in how it operates in the world? And we are seeing, I think, a real rise in interest in data about corporate sustainability, which I'm pretty hopeful about, although obviously not, we're going to have to see how it plays out. But what's happening, and this is partly as a result of books like Green to Gold or The Triple Bottom Line or others that have come out in the last several years, what's happening is that investors are beginning to see sustainability as a sign of good corporate governance, right? So let's take the flip side. Why would a lack of sustainability be a sign of bad corporate governance? Well, there was a soda company, and I've forgotten if it was Pepsi or Coke or one of their derivatives, that went to operate in an area of India, decided that they didn't really need to worry too much about the use of the water there because they would just use whatever they wanted, and they were shut down by the community because they were operating in a dumb and unsustainable and not really appropriate way. So what's happening is that sustainability, however that's defined, and that's a whole other question, but really some combination of environmental, social, and governance factors, ESG factors, a lot of investors are beginning to see this as this means you have a well-run company. So it's kind of enlightened self-interest for them. And I think for those of us who simply care about this because we care about it, it means there's more data available that can begin to drive companies to more responsible ways of operating. Well, this can happen on a large scale. Unilever is a very interesting example. Their CEO, they are often cited by at least some of the environmental advocates I've talked to as really being in the forefront of being serious about sustainability. They've also seen their stock price go up considerably in the last year or two, or whatever it's been since their CEO took over. So there are beginning to be a couple of actually very large-scale models where sustainability and success are going together. The Carbon Disclosure Project shows how you can apply open data to this. So this is an organization that's been around for several years, based in London and New York. They work on voluntary reporting from major companies around the world. And what they're seeing is they now represent institutional investors with 87 trillion with a T worth of assets who use their data in making investment decisions. And this data is all about, it's been traditionally about the carbon use of these companies. They're now getting into water usage as well and some other factors. We're also seeing this very interesting company called Good Guide, which began as a consumer company but is now also being called on more and more by businesses that want to operate more sustainably. They're started by a guy named Dara O'Rourke, who's a professor of environmental science at UC Berkeley. And essentially what you can do with Good Guide is you can program it or just sort of set the filters to give you information about whatever you care about most, whether it's climate change, whether it's health impacts, whatever it is, or some combination of all of the above. And it will tell you for any product that you're thinking about buying, factors based both on the product itself, what it's made of, what the manufacturing conditions were. It'll tell you whether or not this is a product that meets your values. What they're finding is that more and more companies are making commitments to operate in a green way, for example, by using green cleaning supplies. They don't know how to do it. They're coming to them for advice. So again, this is all driven by open data, a lot of it from the EPA. Not all open data. Some of it comes from more proprietary sources that cost something to access, but a lot of it is open government data, and it's an open data project in the sense that it's all about bringing data to the public. Next trend, open data as shaping reputation and brands, otherwise known as nowhere to hide. This is a phenomenon that we're seeing both for individuals and for companies, where the open data that comes out of social media and sources like that is becoming tremendously important to them. So, as I'm sure a lot of you know, we are now up to 2 billion tweets a week. I find that an absolutely terrifying kind of figure. I cannot figure out what people are tweeting about, but they're doing it 2 billion times a week. So, we all know the tremendous kind of clout that social media has. What's interesting, though, and I think what's fairly new, is beginning to think about this not just as somebody slammed my restaurant on Yelp or somebody wrote a great review for me on Yelp, but beginning to look at this as a kind of corpus of data. I mean, once you get into the billions, you're not going to sit there and read every single tweet, but you're going to be interested in what the gestalt is of all that social media. And that's what's starting to happen now, looking at it as open data and finding ways to analyze it as open data. So one of the phenomena we have here is the reputation police. Michael Furtick, who's the founder of Reputation.com out in California, they are all about, how do you watch and understand and improve your online reputation. And this gets to be kind of tricky. I mean, what their recommendation to people is, well, you never want anybody to write a fake positive review, but you might find customers of yours who already have positive feelings about your product and encourage them to write something. So, there's a thin line here between gaming the system and simply watching your reputation. But I think simply the fact that this company exists testifies to the fact that people are concerned about this, individuals, companies, and concerned, again, not just about the odd comment that somebody made somewhere, but about almost a kind of visible form of public opinion that's coming out of social media. Well, one of the things that I find most interesting in all this is sentiment analysis. Now, I want to just ask, is this a technology that people in this room are familiar with or have done any work with? Yeah. So again, you probably know more about it than me, but I just find it very, very interesting. And I always think, if Jane Austen and Alan Turing had a love child, it would be sentiment analysis, because it really is about sort of taking these human emotions and analyzing them in a really rigorous kind of way. My sense of this is that this is a maturing but not yet mature technology. I've talked a lot to a guy named Seth Grimes, who also runs an annual symposium on sentiment analysis. I know the next one in New York is going to be early March, and if you're just learning about this area and want to see a good representation of people working on it, it's an excellent place to start. But this is fascinating, and I think at some point, as analytics improve and so on, this is going to get real, and it's already, I think, meaningful, and I think it could get very meaningful, and is probably the best way to make sense out of this massive amount of social media data and look at it as data and see what do you do with it when you begin to quantify it and analyze it. There's also a very powerful form of open data that's now coming from consumer complaints. So I met these two people, Courtney Powell and AJ Foudy, who founded this company called Public Demand. I mean, you can just see from their picture, they look like, really, really pleasant, just nice people. And, I was interviewing Courtney Powell, and she just sort of was telling me in this, just really kind of friendly way how her goal in life is to bring companies like AT&T to their knees, and she does it very well. I mean, you don't want to mess with her. She had this idea to start Public Demand. I think two things happened. One is her cable company, I've forgotten which one it was, told her that they owed her $900, and she didn't, and she had to fight them for a week, and then she got on a flight to Chicago, and she had the worst service she's ever had, and on that flight, she started sketching out the plan for Public Demand. So what these guys do is they not only take your complaints and publicize them, but they find ways to use social media to amplify them. So this becomes a platform for complaining in a way that is heard around the world. And they've had a couple of really great successes in getting companies to turn around. This is complaints as open data. And again, it's not one person complained, it's the quantity of complaints in a way that becomes visible in a quantifiable way. You're also seeing this with a government-run program now from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This is a real success story. So one of the mandates for the CFPB under Dodd-Frank was to begin collecting consumer complaints and make them publicly available. And they do this on credit cards, they do this on banks, they're doing this on mortgages, and there it is, submit a complaint. Well, what's fascinating about this is really having a very rapid impact. So both American Banker and Forbes have recently run big articles about how banks are scrambling now to deal with this stuff because it's all public. It's all out there. It's all quantifiable. I don't know if the CFPB does this or if other analysts have done it, but there have certainly been studies now where they, like a guy at Yale, Ian Ayers, who's done a lot of work in this area, did a paper recently called Skeletons in the Database. And he just mined this database. And he said, okay, I'm going to tell you which are the worst banks, and by what measure and by what degree. Because all of this stuff becomes open data that can be quantified and analyzed. And the banks know that, and they want to be as rapid as they can, not only to fix these issues, but to fix them publicly so that they get some public credit for doing it. It's all enlightened self-interest. They didn't wake up one morning and say, gee, wouldn't it be nice if we started treating our customers better? But it's powerful, and it's the power of data made public. We've one or two other examples because I think this area, particularly given my consumer background, I think this area is really important. We're seeing a similar kind of thing with safety and recalls. Consumer Product Safety Commission has the same kind of mandate to make its complaint database open, and they're doing that as well. And then I think this slide is actually, I'm sorry, a little bit misplaced. I meant to move it with the investment slides, but it's really the same kind of idea. One of the things that's also happening on a governmental level is enforced disclosure of really just bad corporate practices. So this picture is taken from a National Geographic story on conflict minerals. Conflict minerals for a long time are minerals that have been mined under incredibly inhumane conditions in the Republic of the Congo. And they are in probably just about every electronic device that any of us owns. So the question has been what to do about this. There have been a lot of nonprofit and advocacy groups that have been advocating on this, but what's happened now is the Security and Exchange Commission under Dodd-Frank has said every company has to disclose whether or not they're using these conflict minerals. Now, this is a mixed bag. I mean, it may mean that a lot of companies simply flee, and the ones that remain keep doing the same thing even worse and simply don't care about the bad publicity. But I think when the idea that the SEC would say this has to be public in the same way that they're saying other kinds of mining conditions and other kinds of really sort of international labor conditions have to be made public, if that's a trend that continues, we're going to see that as a source of of open data that can have a real social impact globally. So that's, I think, an evolving story, but a very important one. Three more, and then we can have some conversation. So I'll go through these quickly. Four. I don't know how to count. I told you I was not a technical person. I'm not mathematical either. 6, 7, 8, 9 would be 4, but I'll still go through them quickly. Personal data is a very important and special kind of open data. So nobody is advocating that all of your health records and everything else just become open data. But there is a lot of effort now in making them available to you. So people I talk to consider this a form of open data because it's opening this data back to the person who it's about in a very controlled way, but a very important way. Now, this gets into all kinds of issues around privacy and how do you manage it and so on. But I think there are a couple of things that we already know. The first thing we know is that these little disclosures are just a bad joke. I mean, nobody ever reads them. And somebody recently calculated that if you were to read all the terms of service on every website you ever go to, you would be spending 30 days a year doing that. So unless you have a month in which you really want to drive yourself crazy, you're just not going to do it. So I think there's a pretty universal understanding now that this is actually worse than useless because it's the appearance that you're signing on to something that you don't even understand. What's beginning to replace this, and what's beginning to replace this in ways that, for example, the World Economic Forum is now starting to talk about at a pretty high level, is the idea of data vaults and the concept that Doc Searls has come up with called vendor relationship management. So the idea here is, and this is a little bit difficult to see this diagram, but the basic idea is that there's data out there about you, like your medical data. You would have a personal secure data vault where you take in that information and you hold it, and you use it, you share it at your discretion with your doctor, your insurance company, or whoever it is. Well, from a marketing perspective, this gets kind of interesting because one of the questions is, what would it be worth, for example, a luxury car dealer to know that you're in their demographic, and what would it be worth to you to tell them that you're in their target demographic? So some people talk about a model. Vendor relationship management is intentionally, it's like the opposite of customer relationship management, right? There's all those vendors out there. You want to give them your data in selective ways. It's worth $2,000 for somebody to get a qualified customer onto the lot of a luxury car shop because of the likelihood that they're going to buy. They could give you $200 to come in or something. So there are some people who are seeing this as opening data selectively in ways that really change the customer-vendor dynamic. On the social level, there's tremendous social value to be gained from this kind of intentional sharing of personal data. And I think one of the most compelling examples is PulsePoint, which has the modest but really not modest but really inspiring goal of enabling citizen superheroes. This is an app that's now available in a couple of cities. If you know CPR, you let them know. You share that personal data. You let them know that you know CPR and you're willing to assist if necessary. They then have a network where if somebody is suffering cardiac arrest, that goes into their network. They instantly find the volunteers who can get to that person quickly, who have told them that they know CPR, and they connect them and they save a life. So, everywhere from like the Mercedes-Benz dealer to life-saving CPR, the intentional, controlled, voluntary sharing of personal data can have a big impact, and it's going to be part of the open data universe. Next trend is the Open Research Lab. So, I said at the beginning that even though a lot of the discussion about open data is about open data from government, a lot of the most important open data comes from other sources, and the scientific community is probably number one. So there's been a lot of work lately on many different levels to figure out what can happen when open data is shared, when scientific data is shared openly. And there are a couple levels to this. I feel very honored to be speaking here in a conference room named after Aaron Swartz, who, of course, devoted a lot of his life to this particular problem and to trying to make scientific and other kinds of data available to people in free and open ways. And what has happened at the federal level recently is you've seen just last week, I think there was legislation passed that now about half of all the scientific research funded by the federal government is going to have to be made available to the public within 1 year after it's published in a peer-reviewed journal. So this whole kind of problem that we've had for years of the peer-reviewed journals wanting to continue charging thousands of dollars for data that, for essentially for findings that the federal government paid for with your tax dollars, we're really beginning to break into that. But what's even more profoundly, what has the potential for even more profound change is what if scientists shared data openly while they were still working on problems, not just after they published their results? Well, we have a very good model for this with the Human Genome Project, about whatever it was 20 years ago, where the scientific community really made an agreement that they were going to share data at an early stage. And by some analyses, it accelerated the progress by something like 30% versus a more kind of private model. This was a great experiment a few years ago. Some scientists had been stumped for, I think, about a decade trying to figure out the protein structure of a protein related to the AIDS virus, and they put it on this site, Foldit. They invited gamers to work on it, and the gamers solved it very quickly. And when they published the paper in Nature, they said it was probably the first time that gamers had made a scientific breakthrough of this sort. And that model, it's kind of crowdsourcing, it's kind of collective intelligence, but it's essentially sharing their information and letting other people work with it in ways that really accelerate progress. Well, you're seeing some of this push now coming from people who have a very vested interest in this. This is Kathy Giusti. She's the CEO of the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. She was diagnosed, I think, in her early 30s with multiple myeloma, was kind of shocked to find that nobody was really doing research on it. She started a foundation with a proviso that if you take her money or her foundation's money, you got to make your research available to other researchers, to the public, as you're creating the data. And her quote, you can see here, is that if patients knew how research works, they would be beside themselves. The system's really, really broken. You have more and more health advocates saying that the traditional way of doing it, which is every lab does its own thing, and they just sort of, the most important thing for them is to be first, not to actually cure people. They don't accept that model. And we're seeing this change now with Alzheimer's research in a number of different ways, Parkinson's research, that could really be a new scientific model for us. There's also a lot of work going on in crowdsourcing of scientific problems. This is the Zooniverse project, which began with a project called Galaxy Zoo, where they got, I think, originally about 100,000 people to sign up to look at pictures of galaxies. And this is an interesting phenomenon because it was started by a guy at Oxford who was a colleague of Robert Simpson's here, who, for his PhD thesis, was working on some problem related to spiral galaxies. And I think it's something like, if you have a blue spiral galaxy, it's more interesting than a green one or something like this. Computers apparently are not very good at doing this kind of visual distinction. Humans are. This guy decided for his PhD thesis he was going to do it. He went through 50,000 images in a week and was then like ready to, jump off of some Oxford tower. So he decided, what about crowdsourcing this? And he signed up about 100,000 people very, very quickly who loved the idea of contributing to science by doing this kind of simple but very important analysis. They've now expanded that model in all kinds of ways. This is a project using cancer cells. I think they've just gotten a major grant to continue working not only on astronomical problems but other kinds of scientific problems as well. And that kind of approach can be used for social good also. If you've heard recently, there's been a lot of very good press about this organization, SkyTruth, which is working, among other things, on fracking. And they became famous because the guy who started it looked at publicly available maps of the Gulf region after the BP oil spill and was able to calculate, because of his training, that the actual damage to that region was not about $1 billion, but was much closer to $20 billion, and I think had a really significant impact on the settlement for that disaster. He's now taking this further, and he's crowdsourcing this and getting thousands of people, for example, to look at images of fracking sites in Pennsylvania and see what they can determine about what it's doing to the environment. So the same kind of approach that uses open data and sends it out to the crowd to figure out something about spiral galaxies can be used to figure out whether fracking is destroying your community, your community's environment. And finally, this is a project that was begun by Beth Novak, our director at the GovLab, called Peer to Patent. Her basic insight was that the patent system was overwhelmed because what you have to do with every patent application is figure out if somebody's done the similar thing before. It's what the lawyers call prior art. She realized that by putting all this stuff out there in the open and getting experts to look at it who had expertise in those areas, they could much more quickly figure out whether or not something was patentable. And this is an approach that's now still being used very, very productively. The eighth trend is data-driven cities, where I think open data is playing a number of different roles, and I think probably a lot of work you all do with city data relates to this as well. You may be familiar with the Center for Urban Science and Progress that we have in Brooklyn from NYU, which is doing a lot of work on urban informatics. My next slide. Oh yeah, there it is. And this is the kind of stuff where, for example, they would put sensors all over Brooklyn to measure temperature, air, water, etc., and develop a large amount of open data that can then be analyzed for all these different kinds of purposes. And we've certainly seen a number of cities, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Palo Alto, that have really been pioneers. San Francisco should be on this list. That have really been pioneers in liberating data, open data about their cities, and inviting citizens to hack at it and do some interesting things. Well, one of the things that I'm starting to see is that some of these things that begin as an app for one city very quickly become scalable to a whole region or to the whole country. Nextbus is one, which is now available in a number of different cities in the US. And there's another very interesting company based in California called OpenGov. And I think of this as SimCity meets participatory budgeting. So when I interviewed these guys, one of them compared what they were doing to SimCity, which I think they immediately regretted, but they let me keep some version of the quote in the book. But it is kind of like that. Their basic insight was that most cities have budget and other data in really unusable forms, and that it would not be that impossible to create a platform that you could use for any city's data. So they began with the city of Palo Alto. The mayor of Palo Alto has been a big fan of theirs and really has pushed this forward. They're now in about 20 cities, many of them in California, but some on the East Coast as well. And what they do is they turn complex spreadsheets into something about as simple as that. You can take it to a town hall meeting. You can use it to compare your city's performance with neighboring cities. It becomes a very powerful tool. We've also been working at NYU. Well, of course, the whole question of how do you encourage people to use city data is one that we've been looking at NYU. We've come up with a basic kind of concept that we're calling an idea-a-thon, which is what if you not only get coders but also get policy makers into the same room at the same time. And we've tried this on some problems like bus safety and price gouging. And we found that it really leads to a different kind of conversation. And I think that may be a model that people want to begin to follow in some of these open data applications. And this is one that I thought was especially interesting. This is an experiment that Mayor Vincent Gray did applying sentiment analysis to the city of Washington. So this has been a major project using a sentiment analysis firm there called New Brand Analytics to try to figure out, look at social media, see what people are saying about the government agencies, and they actually give them a grade. And when they first did this, the highest grade out of 5 agencies was C+, the other 4 were C-. For some bizarre reason, the people who ran those agencies weren't thrilled to have this out in the public, but apparently the mayor insisted. He said, look, they're saying it, and now the grades have gone up. Whether this is grade inflation or whether the sentiments are really getting better is maybe a point of discussion. But I think the main point is this is a really interesting thing where a city is both inviting data in, using social media as an open data source to assess its own performance, and then making the results open as well. So it just shows there's a lot of ways for this kind of interaction between cities and citizens to happen. And then the last thing I want to talk about is just what I'm calling learning to live in a see-through world. I think in many ways the most profound effects of open data are going to be things like organizations like Sunlight, which are bringing all kinds of interesting facts about campaign finance and other kinds of political secrets out into the open. ProPublica, which I'm a huge fan of ProPublica. I think they've really done tremendous work figuring out how to use open data in the service of journalism and are constantly breaking really interesting stories. Or this is my favorite name for a website ever. It's called IPaidAbribe.com. It's an Indian website where people can report what bribe they had to pay and use this as a way of making corruption a form, bringing open data to corruption in a way that begins to reduce corruption. There's a similar site in Russia called Rospil that apparently has been very effective as well. So having gone through those trends, I'm going to just show you for a tiny bit about this project we're doing now at NYU, and then I think we still have about 20 minutes at least for questions and discussion. So at the GovLab, we looked at this whole sort of universe of open data and said, it's all great. We know it's worth something. McKinsey says it's worth $3 trillion or more. How do we really begin to get a handle in a rigorous way on how people are using this? So we started something called the Open Data 500, and the challenge was, people ask, why did you pick 500 companies? It's like, well, there's a Fortune 500, and 500 is a big number, and we just wanted to see if we could do it. So we're still trying to figure out if it's going to work, but I think we're pretty close. We have started this thing called the Open Data 500, which is our assessment of 500 companies that are either U.S.-based or have a big presence in the U.S. that are using open data as a key part of their business resource. The basic criteria are that it has to be national or regional in scale. And as I was saying before, we've really covered a wide range of sectors here. We're now going to replicate it in the UK, and we've had interest from about 15 other countries in doing the same thing. So I think all of this is showing you that the people who are looking at open data, even from an advocacy point of view, from a governmental point of view, are very, very interested in the economic value, because ultimately that has to become one of the drivers. And Vivian, can I just do this, or will I end up somewhere I don't want to be here? So I'm just going to show you the website.